We now have two massive interviews with Hidetaka Miyazaki himself about what we can expect in the shadow of the Erdtree. As a lot of people guessed, Miyazaki confirms that we'll enter the DLC through Miquella's cocoon. I really like this as a choice. Not only is it thematically appropriate, it also works from a mechanical standpoint, since the difficulty for the DLC has been designed with the endgame in mind. Having to defeat Mohg to get there is a great filter, and at the same time, it's not that hard to reach Mohg. You only have to defeat a demigod and then do part of Vare's questline, and then you can see the molester himself. So obviously Miquella is going to be a major player in this DLC, and Miyazaki says that essentially the player will be following in those footsteps of Miquella in the same way that they followed the blessings from the sites of grace in the lands between. According to Miyazaki, this land of shadows is going to be pretty massive. It's on par or even bigger than Limgrave, and it's going to be filled with open fields, large-scale legacy dungeons, and smaller to medium-scale legacy dungeons as well. That was one of the criticisms of Elden Ring, that the map just got to be way too massive and too open for its own good. Now this is purely speculation on my part, but since we have all of these massive dungeons in a pretty contained space, I wonder if there's going to be a repeat of the fantastic world design we saw in Dark Souls, where everything is tightly nestled and interconnected with each other. With everything contained in a land the size of Limgrave, who knows? According to Miyazaki, the Land of Shadow, it's a brand new map separate from the lands between. It is a land that is overshadowed by the particular shadow of the Erdtree, as opposed to the Erdtree in the lands between. And it takes place, again, on an entirely separate, physically separate map, so it will involve a warp of sorts to get there. In terms of setting and themes, it technically occupies the same space as the lands between, the same universe, but due to something story-related that we won't reveal today, this has become physically disconnected, and you'll travel to the shadow of the Erdtree land as a separate place. In the interviews, he also talks about some of the bosses and enemies we can encounter, but not that much. He doesn't even want to reveal the names because apparently they would be too much of a spoiler. The few details he gives are actually pretty disturbing. For instance, this weird flame thing, the kindling that you see is actually the remains of bodies that were put in there to burn. So there's that friendly fellow. All told, we can expect over 10 new boss fights. These bosses were designed with the endgame in mind, and at least one of them might be on par with Melania. So we have that to look forward to. Miyazaki also gives us a little morsel of lore about Messmer, the throne that Messmer sits in. People may recognize this throne to be one of those from the boss room where you battle Morgott, and this represents the thrones at the base of the Erdtree, and it's supposed to symbolize that Messmer stands on equal footing to those other demigods and children of America who sat around in these thrones and held the rooms of the Erdtree. So he is an important figure who rivals these other demigods, and as you play the DLC, you will learn a little bit about why he wasn't featured in the Legends of the Erdtree. You'll realize why he exists in this shadow, this land of shadow. The fact that he should be considered on par with the other demigods almost essentially confirms to me that he is a child of America, and most likely Radagon, given the red hair. And from a psychological standpoint, he's also heavily linked with a lot of what's been suppressed by the lands between, including fire, snakes. So in a way, he also seems to represent the sort of Jungian psychological shadow as well, which is very clever. I'm also getting a bit of a Nameless King vibe, that he might have been this really powerful figure, but he was erased from the annals of history. Although George R.R. Martin didn't write anything new or additional for the DLC, according to Miyazaki, the mythos that Martin provided is still very much in use. As for George Martin's involvement, essentially it is the same as it was with the base game. The DLC Shadow of the Erdtree is based on one part of that original mythos that he penned for us. It's simply another part of the original story that we thought fit to tell as a new expansion. Another reassuring sign for the lore and the storytelling for Shadow of the Erdtree. Finally, I'll wrap this up with one really funny comment from Miyazaki and one that might be a bit heartbreaking. First, the comedy. According to Miyazaki, the Shadow of the Erdtree will in fact include a poison swamp. In his words, this was actually a point of introspection for me after creating the base game. It was only after creating it that I realized I really like to create poison swamps. and there was a little piece of introspection and reflection for me. So maybe, when players reach the poison swamp in the DLC, they will feel a little bit of this retrospection. It doesn't say what type of poison we can expect. I'm personally thinking it might be a swamp of deathblight, but it could also be sleep. No word on if he's adding feet to the game as well. And then finally, Shadow of the Erdtree is the last piece of Elden Ring content we can expect in the near future. According to Miyazaki, we don't have any current plans to make a second DLC or a sequel, but we definitely don't want to snuff out that possibility. We think there could well be something in the future. While they might make a second DLC or a sequel, to me it doesn't sound like they are even in pre-production on that process. So if they do create another sequel or another DLC, it might be a while, so savor Shadow of the Erdtree as much as possible. Thank you so much for watching. As a content creator, I am very glad that FromSoft finally gave us something new to talk about.